Hello, and welcome to this month in the Know, a conversation about social isolation. My name is Victoria Kettis, and I'm a mom of two young adults, and I'm also a manager and facilitator with Family Smart. With gratitude, we acknowledge that we are in the unceded traditional territories of the Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, and Musqueam nations. We know relationships matter, and we commit to building and deepening our connections with the First Peoples on whose land we live, love, and work. I am joined together today by Diane and Christine. Welcome. Thanks for joining me this evening, you two. And I'll let you lead it off by introducing yourselves. How about you go first, Diane?
My name's Diane, and I'm a single parent to two young adult boys who are 23 and 24 now. And I'm also one of the provincial parents and residents working out of the Kelty Mental Health Centre.
My name is Christine, and I've been working in practice as a registered clinical counselor for several years now, and also been involved in research with anxiety. And at the moment, I just recently returned to school, and I'm the doctoral member of the Scientific Advisory Council of Anxiety Canada.
Awesome. Thanks so much for being here and going back to school. There's some great things to be doing at this time in the world. So social isolation affects many of our children, and it can be hard to know if it's in reaction to a situation, to technology dependence, their development, or to their anxiety. Today, as we speak about the topic of social isolation, we are connecting it to our children's anxiety. There are so many questions about what we can do, what's causing it, and how it impacts our children's and families' mental health. So Diane, I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about what this has looked like in your family.
Sure. So in our family, I would say we've been dealing with social isolation issues probably for about 22 years. I always kind of say that my youngest son was born anxious. So by the time he was around 1, there was definite signs of anxiety. He didn't like leaving our house, stuff like that. We actually lived next door to a friend who always used to joke that she knew if I was leaving my house or coming back to my house based on which child was crying, because I had one who loved to leave and one who hated to leave. So it's kind of been something that's been a mainstay in our family. And it looked like a lot of disappointments, honestly. It looked like a lot of frustrations and unmet expectations for myself. We have this picture of what we're going to do as parents and what our family is going to look like and how we're going to participate in family functions and traditions and celebrations. And when you're dealing with a child who has social isolation issues, all of that kind of goes out the window. At least it did for us. So it sounded like a lot of tears and a lot of frustration and slammed doors and sometimes anger, but a lot of disappointment. And I had to come to terms with it being okay to be upset about that and being okay to be frustrated and sad and disappointed, because it's not the picture that I had for my family. And I think it's a really important step for families to acknowledge that and be able to grieve kind of the loss of expectation. You're losing a picture of what you thought you signed up for. And what you ended up with can be very, very different. So it's a hard place, but it gets better. It did for us. So in our family, it looked like a lot of challenges.
Mm-hmm. And I imagine, and having two children, those challenges become louder because one's different than the other. So there's a whole lot of not just disappointment on your behalf as a parent, but also on another child's behalf. And I'm sure some sad feelings for the child who's isolated because they see themselves as different and not always fitting into the family.
Absolutely. So true. My older son, who is very similar to me in personality, is very outgoing, will go anywhere at any time and do anything. And then we have, a brother who's completely the opposite of that. And when there's just 3 of us in that family unit, someone is always not getting what they want. Someone is always put out. Someone is always upset because a play date gets cut short, or we just simply can't go, or we're forced to go, or so there's a lot of give and take and compromise and emotions and feelings to be met and dealt with.
Yeah. I recall that with my children. It was a big one to always have to try and make one be happy. And they ended up, there was a lot of resentment between the two of them because somebody always had to do without what they needed in those times. So thank you for sharing that and how it was for your family. Christine, we hear from Diane how hard this is. You're connecting with families, well, when they know that they can't do this alone and need support. Can you tell us a little bit about what is social isolation and what are you hearing from families?
So social isolation is really about having that lack of social interactions and relationships. So it's kind of from an objective standpoint, and it's a little bit different than loneliness, which is more subjective, and that's where people kind of perceive that their emotional or social needs aren't being met. And so, exactly as Diane said, there's a lot of families that where there's a lot of tension, and they're trying to daily negotiate and figure out how to make things work. And it's tiring for parents and children. Another thing that I'm hearing from families and from parents is that, parents come in and they feel like they've tried several strategies and nothing is working for them. So there's a little bit of hopelessness that can, that parents are sharing. But the good news is that they are coming in. And when they do come in for help, we can definitely work together and build some strategies and help families to find a way that works for them.
So Diane, parents are wondering how we can engage our kids in healthy social connections without feeling like we're always nagging at them. I know that was a big issue for my son. And I don't know if we always found a balance, but we found ways to, and he gained confidence in being able to share some of the things I needed to know as his mom. So how do you find balance in this, and what strategies do you use?
I think balance is a tricky word. I don't think we ever found it. I feel like what worked today didn't work tomorrow, and then something totally different worked the next week. And you're trying to always sort of find balance. I threw that concept out the window because I felt like I was never getting there. And so for me, it became more of today. Let's get through today. And whatever that looked like, if everyone went to bed and had some kind of success in their day, that was a win. So that was the best that I got for balance, I would say. In terms of strategies, it's a hard one. Again, because strategies change so much, I found, as kids grow and new dynamics enter. But one thing that was a constant is finding ways to connect with your child that have them enter, not having them enter into our world, but us entering into their world. So instead of expecting, your child to always be the one to join outside of their room or outside of their house, find ways that you can be in their space and on their level. And it could be, over a YouTube channel that they enjoy, or a game they like to play, or a book they like to read, anything that's sort of their comfort zone and that they're leading with. If you can find places to connect on their terms, it goes a long way in building that relationship that then kind of gives you open doors down the road. So that was one thing. Another thing that I found in connecting with my son as he got older was it didn't always have to be verbal communication. We got a lot of things accomplished through text message, good things and bad things. I heard the whole gamut of things through text messaging. And I never thought that I would be sitting 6 feet and a doorway closed from a child and texting him to have a conversation, but it worked. So things like that, be willing, I would say, to try things that you never thought you would be the person to do. I never thought that I would be that parent, but here we are, and it worked. The other thing I would say is continue to always make the offer of inclusion. When you deal with social isolation in a child for so long, the pattern for me was always, I know he's going to say no, And one day I stopped asking. So instead of framing things as, we're going out for dinner, do you want to come? It started just being, we're going out for dinner, because I knew the answer would be no from him. And when I stopped asking, I had no idea the impact that made on him. And he noticed that. So it was a lesson that I had to learn. Always offer whatever it is, no matter their age, whether it's to join the family for dinner at the table, a trip out for dinner, a play date in the park, whatever. Always make the offer. That was a lesson I learned the hard way. So that's just kind of a couple things that sort of I did over time, I would say, with my kids.
Those are great lessons, and I really appreciate the learning, the hard learning that you had with your son, and having him remind you that he's still a part of this family and wants to be included, but just can't always join you because he's not able to. And I think it's an important differentiation of it's not that our kids don't want to be with us or join in. There's times where I really know that my son wished he could have, but he wasn't able to. So what a great gift that he gave you to let you know that it means so much, you offering. So thank you for that insight.
That is so, so true. I feel like that it's easy to lose sight of the fact that it's not that they don't want to all the time. It's often that they can't. Yeah.
Thank you. Christine, you not only work alongside families, but you're also part of the Scientific Advisory Committee for Anxiety Canada. I'm so grateful for your wisdom and your voice in that. So what are some best practices and skills families can look to help themselves, their children, and their family as a whole?
Well, there's many things that I'm sure that we'll cover throughout this conversation. But I think a really good place to start is to talk about self-care for parents. And I know that's something that's a very popular topic right now, but especially when you're having to, as Diane mentioned, deal with daily challenges, and it is tiring, and it's important for parents to know that it is challenging to parent a child who's struggling with social isolation. So I think what's helpful for parents to consider is to take stock of what they really need in terms of supports, and to think about what they have in place, and to see if that's something that actually matches. And if it isn't, then it's a good opportunity to think about what you need to get those things in place so that you are in a better spot to help your children.
Great. What does that feel like for you as a mom, Diane?
Self-care is hard. It's really, really hard. Yeah, when it's day in and day out. And as Christine said earlier, it's exhausting. And self-care, I had this image of self-care in my head of, I should be going to the gym, or I should be swimming, or I should be, like all of these things I should be doing. And you just can't. You can't always do those things. And for me, self-care became, I had this little thing just for myself every day, one thing that I could look forward to. And it was sometimes super minor, like ice cream in the freezer after the kids had gone to bed that I had hidden. No one knew was there. The 10 minutes with ice cream was the best self-care, And as a single parent too, with two kids who, especially when they were young, I couldn't just go places. So you have to get creative. And often the last thing you want to do at the end of your day is look after yourself. But for me, having that even one thing that I could look forward to every day, it was sort of my own little reward. And that was the best I could do for a long, long time.
What you're saying is really important there, Diane, about how it doesn't have to be, setting aside an hour to leave the home and to, set up all these other things in place in your life, but even just doing something small for yourself, like the ice cream, or going to take a bath, an extra long bath, so no one can bother you.
Exactly.
I think those things, being creative, but also being realistic with what you can actually do within your the time frame and your life. And another thing is that by engaging in those things, even if they're small, it's really good modeling for our kids to see that we do take care of ourselves, even if it is in small ways.
Okay, self-care. We know that it can be hard, but I think it is about finding that one thing, and it can be something that we have to do anyways, but that we find joy in. So, being gentle with ourselves as we find our way. I think as we move on from self-care, what's one of the next things that you would talk about as strategies and skills we can be looking to?
Well, I think Diane brought up one of them earlier, actually, which is to really connect with your child based on their interests. So there's lots of things that she suggested, which are great ideas. It could be learning how to play Minecraft with them, or doing things that they're interested in without an agenda.
That's huge. Everything doesn't have to have an agenda. I had to learn that the hard way too. Sometimes you're just hanging out with your kid in their room looking at Minecraft builds because you're looking at Minecraft builds. And my son was always like, what are you trying to get me to do? You know, you don't have to have an agenda in everything you do. I think it's beneficial to not always have an agenda.
I think another strategy that families may want to try in terms of setting up the stage for implementing some strategies is to think about how they have conversations with each other, and to think about the timing of when they bring up topics. Some families really like to have discussions around the dinner table. Others prefer to do it when they're in the car, where there's not the face-to-face aspect. And kids are strapped into to their seatbelts so they can't jump out. But I think that's something often it's on parents' minds quite a bit. And so any opportunity to bring it up, they might spring it on their kids. And I think it's better to be more planful in terms of bringing up those types of conversations.
Yes, good idea to also give them opportunity to just come into their home without having to always be questioned. Because as parents, we often worry so much about them, and we want to know that they're okay, and we forget to just let them be kids and not always talk about their anxiety. So it's a great thing to be able to have them have that space so they can do that.
I would also add that one thing that for our family was important is to be mindful of the space you're having the conversations in when there's a sibling around. That
great point.
Good point.
Not everything is wanting to be shared from one sibling to another. So another learning curve for me that I had to go through was, my son didn't want to talk when his brother was around. He didn't want to talk in the car. If you could get him one-on-one, often the conversation would flow. But when his brother was around, it shut things down pretty quickly.
And sometimes finding activities where you're engaging in something that doesn't take a lot of brain power can be really helpful with having those conversations. Because if they're uncomfortable, it helps to have an activity where you might be able to do something with your hands and keep focus that way.
So one of the things that comes to mind is that idea of listen more and talk less. And I've heard it come out in different ways, but do you want to elaborate a bit more on some of the other pieces that can come into play, Christine?
Yeah, definitely. I think this is good for good advice for everybody when there's an important topic, whether it's a friend or your child or even as a clinician. Sometimes especially if someone's not very forthcoming with information, we tend to talk to fill up that silence. And so it's important for us to allow them that space. Some people need that time to gather their thoughts or to work up the courage to say something difficult. And sometimes it just feels uncomfortable, so people don't want to rush into having a conversation. So I think one thing that we can consider is how listening more, but also how we ask those questions. Are we doing the rapid fire, bam, 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 bam kind of questions, closed-ended questions? If the purpose is to engage and learn more about our children and their experience, then we have to be, again, very, very thoughtful about the types of questions we're asking.
Are there any more of those set the stage kind of things that you're thinking of as we get ready to move into some practical strategies?
I think there's a couple of things that kind of blend in to set the stage and also practical strategies. One thing that I like to discuss with parents and families in general is about what are the rules and the expectations at home. And having a very clear idea from the parent's perspective as well as from the kids so that everybody is on the same page. And also sometimes checking to see if those expectations are developmentally appropriate. There can be times where, parents might set an expectation that might not be very realistic for their child. And that just kind of sets families up for disappointment. So we want to make sure that the expectations are clear and consistent is the other important piece there.
I would add too that in developmentally appropriate things, that as my son got older, realizing that there were times he could stay home and that was okay. And that was important because it allowed him to have a voice in the scenario, and it allowed him to have a little bit of freedom, responsibility, but it also sort of solved our problem, so to speak. It didn't have to always be an argument or a fight to leave the house, because as he got older and was able to stay home for shorter periods of time and then eventually longer periods of time. But it was hard to transition that way as a parent who was used to always, well, we all have to go. So that's kind of a piece that I like to encourage parents with. Your child is going to get older, and it's not always going to be a fight, because they're going to be able to stay home eventually. And that doesn't mean that they always stay home, but kind of once that piece was removed for us, it made the having to leave times a little bit easier.
Within what you said there, it brings up a good point about being able to offer, especially teenagers, choice. Because then they feel like they have some agency and they have some input. And when they have a say, then they might be a little bit more, there might be a little bit more buy-in on their end, rather than seeing things as being forced on them. So I think that just helps in general to foster, nurturing relationships.
That's absolutely how it played out for us, for sure. There was a lot more agreeability on some of the things where it was you have to come, when there was choice being allowed to be made on his part. And he was allowed to have say in, but I don't want to go to the grocery store. I don't want to go wherever. And he didn't have to. And it really did make a big difference for us as he got older.
Well, I think about all these different pieces and how we really have to meet the child where they're at with how we set that stage before we get into some of the more practical strategies that we often hear that are connected to when we have children living with anxiety and how we support them through that. Christine, do you want to walk through some of those strategies that we can kind of get through as things that we hear as evidence-based and how they can play out in the family?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So there are some, as you mentioned, evidence-based strategies. And what I'm talking about specifically is cognitive behavioral therapy. And so some of the strategies that I'll be talking about are based in that theory. And I think before I even get into those strategies, I really want to highlight that the goals that families set and how they implement some of these strategies will look very different. So it'll depend on their child, it'll depend on the caregivers, and what is accessible to them at any point in time. And creativity is going to be very important as well. So,
so true,
as Diane has learned. And so, I'll give some strategies, but I think it's important for families to know that there is some flexibility in terms of how these things are implemented for each family. So I think that an important step in terms of a starting place is to really be able to discuss from a factual point about what anxiety is. Sometimes people are afraid to label it as anxiety because they're worried about, there's stigma around that, or it might make it a bigger thing than it is. But it's important because one way is that it gives you a common language to discuss things within your family. And the other piece is that the more that they're aware about what anxiety is, the less that they start to wonder about what's wrong with them, because then there becomes this really clear idea of what this experience it is that they're having. So some things about anxiety for children and teens to know about is that, you can think of it as a wave. It comes and it reaches a peak. And at some point, even if we do nothing at all, that anxiety will go down. And what tends to happen, though, is that when we feel anxious, it really doesn't feel so nice. So we try and get out of those situations, and we try and avoid doing things that make us feel that way. And by doing that, we actually teach ourselves that we're not able to cope. So if we can think of anxiety as a wave and we can learn to ride that wave, we can see that maybe it's possible that we're capable of dealing with tricky situations and really challenging situations. And another key piece is what maintains anxiety. And it's important for people to know that avoidance really, it feels great in the moment, and short term, it works very, very well, which is why we all engage to the varying degrees in avoidance. But in the long run, it really does maintain that anxiety. So that's an important piece to consider when we talk about some of these strategies.
So now we have a good, strong sense of what anxiety is and some of the things we can do with our kids. What are some of the steps we can then take to help our children through these next parts?
So there's, I guess you can call them some thinking strategies or some cognitive strategies that families can engage in. And one thing is, people who are feeling anxious tend to really overestimate how big a threat is. And then they tend to underestimate their ability to cope with that. And so I think what's really important is for us to start thinking in more realistic ways rather than in just those really negative ways. And by realistic, I want to be clear that I'm not talking about just thinking positively. We want to think in ways that are helpful, but also realistic. So that might mean that if someone, you have your child coming to you and you're wanting to encourage them to go out to a social gathering, they might come up with lots of excuses about why that's not going to be a good idea. What if this happens? What if that happens? And rather than saying, don't worry, everything's going to be fine, because it may or may not be fine, what can be more helpful is to get them to think about, there's any number of things that you can actually encourage them to do. So one thing could be, well, if the worst thing happened, could you handle that? Or how likely is the worst thing to happen? So getting them to think more realistically in those ways. So there's questions that you can ask them to kind of shift their thinking from the focus on the negative to more of a broader picture. Is it possible that maybe it could go well, rather than saying it will go well?
Talking through the what ifs was a huge success for us, from little tiny small things to big scenarios. And there was one time actually when my son was about 11 and he wanted to ride his bike into town. We're about 6 kilometers from town because he wanted to go to the library by himself. And this was obviously going to be a huge thing for him. And so I would say for weeks we talked through, well, what if I get lost? What if I get hit by a car? What if my bike gets stolen? There were so many. And I mean, obviously the vast majority of them are never going to happen, but we did talk through all of those scenarios. So the day came that he was riding to the library, and he didn't come home when he was supposed to. And he didn't have a cell phone. It was before that. So I drove out to look for him, couldn't find him, drove back home, and my phone rang at home, and it was him. And he had ridden his bike into the back of a parked car and hurt himself. And I'm thinking, of all the children in the world for this to happen to, the only scenario we did not go through was riding your bike into the back of a parked car. But he figured out what to do based on all of the scenarios we had talked through. And, he sat there for a little bit. He wasn't seriously hurt. But he went to a house that looked safe and friendly and had a mom at it and asked to borrow the phone. And then the dad came out and asked if he could help fix his bike. And it was all fine. And it was such a huge success, even though it was a disaster, because he handled it. And he handled it exactly correctly. But it was probably dozens of scenarios of practicing the what ifs.
Mm-hmm. And that really shows the benefit, too, of us showing confidence in our children's ability to face anxiety.
Yeah.
And that they can get through it. So well done, Mama.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we've challenged our worried or unhelpful thoughts. We've talked through a lot of some of those what ifs. I know exposure is an important part of when we're looking at cognitive behavior therapy. Can you speak briefly to that?
Yes, definitely. So exposures are arguably the most important, strategy for dealing with anxiety. And what they is really purposeful, gradual steps towards facing, a child's fear or a teen's fear. And so in the case of social isolation, it might be increasing relationships or increasing, socializing. And so the idea is that together with the child, you would come up with the goal. What is their goal very specifically? So maybe it's texting more people, or maybe it's actually going to meet people, in open spaces or whatever it might be, identifying that goal together with the child. And then from there, being able to break down into much smaller steps, brainstorming all different kinds of steps that are smaller, and then sort of ordering them from easiest to hardest, and then step by step beginning to practice those steps over and over again, more than once, as many times. Yes, many times sometimes.
Many times.
And that's an important piece, is the pace of moving through the steps is not as important as how the child is feeling. So if they're noticing that they're, facing those feared situations and they're experiencing the anxiety and feeling that wave and then letting it come down, and they're learning that they're able to cope. The other piece of it is that they're actually start to experience some habituation. And that's when that feared situation doesn't actually seem so scary anymore, because they've experienced it so many times. So it becomes less and less scary. And the reason that we want to break it down into small steps is because if a child has a successful experience with doing something, then they're more willing to go on to the next step. So it really helps to build motivation. So I think that being able to collaborate with children is really important. And I think that the practice piece is so very, very, very important.
I appreciate how hard it is, because we know that when we're doing anything new for the first time, how hard it can be, and that we do need to practice on a regular basis. So I appreciate the reinforcing that this isn't something we can do once and have it go well, or even do twice or three times, that we are going to have those successes and failures, and we're going to have times where we're just like, yes, we've got this, and then it's no, we don't. So being patient while we work with our kids to keep trying and getting creative about how we do it. If it doesn't work one way, trying another way. So thank you for that. There's so many moving pieces to exposure, and I appreciate how much it is that we can keep trying and get inventive and creative in how we do that. Any final skills that we can build on with our kids as we look at those pieces around cognitive behavior therapy, but then moving into some skills that might help them in the moment as they try and cope with these things?
So I think that focusing on social skills can be important for families, because if children don't feel very confident in their ability to connect with others, then that's one extra reason that they're going to want to avoid those situations. And so it can be helpful to teach kids how to communicate assertively. So if they feel they're either too aggressive in the way that they communicate, or they might be the type to be a bit more on the passive side, we want to help them be able to communicate their needs in a way that's respectful to themselves and to the other person. So I think that's an important piece to focus on. And sometimes the way to do that is really by role playing, even for teenagers, to have those situations where, pick the hard situations and the easy situations to role play and get them to rehearse those skills until they become like second nature, so that when they're faced with that anxious situation, they don't have to think about, okay, first I'm going to do this, and then second I'm going to do this. They'll just be able to know what to do because they've practiced it so much in advance. And I think another piece connected to that is being able to regulate our emotions. So whether, we're becoming really frustrated with someone or with something that's going on and then lashing out at other people, or we're feeling really tearful around something, it's always helpful to be able to know how to kind of center ourselves. And so that's another piece, whether it's using relaxation skills, whether it's taking a break. There's lots of different ways of being able to regulate.
Thank you. You've given us so much to think about. And one thing I hear from both of you is that the key messages is that we need to, before we begin teaching our children skills, we really need to connect with them first. We need to take care of our relationship in order for our children to be able to begin to address the challenges. So seeing our children as whole is vital to their success as well as their mental health. So much to consider, and so many great tips and strategies for families to be able to take away from this. Christine, any last thoughts really quickly? Anything else that you'd want us to know? If you had one last sentence or thought to share with us as we head off, what would it be?
Yes. What I would say is make sure to celebrate successes big and small. This is hard work for these kids. They're essentially doing, what they fear most. And so I think it's important to acknowledge and recognize when they are able to take steps towards being brave.
I would encourage parents that there's hope. I feel like, from where I started and the years that we went through to where we are now, I never imagined at 22 that my son would be the capable, competent, independent person that he is. Yes, he's an introvert. He does not have 100 friends. He has a couple of good, solid, close connections, and that's enough for him. So I just be encouraged. I know how hard it is, but eventually things change, things shift, and connections are made. And it does get better.
Thank you. And thank you both for sharing from your hearts such big, hard, and useful information. It's very valuable to our families. Family Smart has been received funding from this project from the Provincial Health Services Authority and the Ministry of Children and Family Development in partnership with Here to Help. Thank you for joining us today. If you're watching this in the know with your local PIR, enjoy the conversation. I know they look so forward to this time with you. And to everyone else, I wish you moments to connect in the everyday so that you can gain strength for the hard ones. Be well, everyone.